Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for joining us for our third Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2020-2021 academic year, Trafalgar Night and Nelson's Victory of 1805. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation, and I also want to thank our trustees, members, friends, and benefactors for their wonderful support for the missions of the Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation, particularly this year with all of its challenges. And a special thank you to our dear friends at the Pritzker Military Foundation on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, who have provided generous support to the foundation for this lecture series. Before I continue, just a reminder that should a question come to you during the presentation, please submit it via the chat box, and I'll be happy to present it to our guest speaker during the Q&A session. As many of you know, this is an event that we typically host monthly during the academic year at the Naval Station Newport Officers Club, usually preceded by a beverage or two and some light snacks in order to mingle with Naval War College Foundation staff and friends, and typically the guest speaker for the evening. But obviously, this challenging COVID environment, we are bringing this presentation and many others hosted by the foundation to you virtually, which have been very successful. A significant benefit to this approach, of course, is we can interact with a broader audience that doesn't have to travel to Newport or go out in crummy weather to attend presentations by the college's renowned faculty. And don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about the rain we've been having recently here. It was long overdue in Newport. Now, to introduce and welcome back your guest speaker this evening, Dr. David Kohnen. Dr. Kohnen is the Captain Tracy B. Kittredge Scholar for War Studies and Maritime History, and the former director of the John V. Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research at the Naval War College, and a retired commander in the United States Navy. David earned his PhD from the University of London King's College in War Studies, Maritime and Naval History, an MA from the Naval War College in National Security and Strategic Studies, an MA from Old Dominion University in History, and a BA in History from the University of Iowa. As director of the Hattendorf Center, David was responsible for fostering academic partnerships among maritime historians worldwide and for educating practitioners and the public through conduct of original documentary research on influence of history upon sea power. He specializes in public history and material culture and has written about the function of museums in delivering military history to the broader audience. He is considered an expert in many areas, including civil military affairs, international relations, maritime history, maritime strategy, and maritime planning. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to a dear friend of the Naval War College Foundation, Dr. David Kohnen. David?
Well, thank you so much, George. It's always great to address this audience. Maritime history, as you know, is something that once you get bitten by the bug of maritime history, it's hard to escape the riches of the maritime past. And tonight, it's my distinct privilege as a graduate of King's College London to be able to deliver the Trafalgar Night remarks on Horatio Nelson. And of course, we all know who Horatio Nelson was. He is the inevitable Nelson and is remembered probably best for his exploits at the Battle of Trafalgar, which happened on this day 2 centuries ago. And of course, the Battle of Trafalgar looms very, very large in the education of American naval practitioners and strategic thinkers since the beginning of the Naval War College. So with that, I'll go ahead and begin my talk tonight. And usually at a Trafalgar Night, at the end of the remarks, there's normally a ritual where you drink Madeira wine to toast the memory of Nelson. This evening, we'll just have to simulate that. But I encourage all to do that after tonight's remarks. Now, Horatio Nelson is somebody who obviously comes from the British side of things, and he did have experience in American waters during the American Revolution. And of course, those revolting Americans deeply upset Horatio Nelson during the War for Independence. And of course, he sort of saw the Americans as the rebels that they were from his point of view. And he wrote to a friend, "I cannot abide these American traitors." That's the perspective that Nelson had on people like George Washington and others during those wars of revolution. And what the Wars of Revolution was all about was about this challenge against monarchy and empire. So the American Revolution is a profoundly important event in Nelson's life, but also later on in life, he had to deal with a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte, who I will talk about a little bit later in those remarks. But Nelson became a heroic figure in the history of the British Empire. And as a result, they put a big statue of him up at a place called Trafalgar Square in downtown London. And Nelson stands looking down from a very high position, looking down at the American, George Washington. There's a statue of George Washington in Trafalgar Square beneath, at the feet of Horatio Nelson. So I wonder what people may think of this. George Washington's statue looks up to Horatio Nelson in Trafalgar Square in London. What's interesting about that statue is it was erected in 1922 after the Americans supported the British and the French, of course, during the First World War. And that war was the first real war in which the United States Navy was participating directly in coalition operations. So it's the Napoleonic period that really is an important inspiration for American naval thinking, not just from the standpoint of revolution, George Washington leading the charge, but let's not forget the Rhode Islander or the grandson of the Rhode Island governor, Benedict Arnold. We should also remember the fact that the American Revolution inspired revolutionary thinkers like Napoleon Bonaparte, who exploited the revolutionary fervor of the rebellion against the crown in France. And he exploited that to create a military state in France. Napoleon's threat against the British Empire was so profound that the British marshaled resources to contain Napoleon. And they did so by using sea power to do that. So let's talk a little bit about those Napoleonic Wars, which generally historians look at that period as being between 1792 and 1815. So the American Revolution had already taken place. The United States came together, and within a couple of years of the United States sprouting out of the British ground like a weed, from Nelson's point of view, you start having trouble on the continent with Napoleon coming to power. And so roughly 1792 through 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte was the big problem for the British Empire. And of course, I always enjoy looking at the popular portrayals of figures like Napoleon Bonaparte. You can see him carving out Europe like it's a cake, and the British character, looking at the oceans as their realm. And so it's that global conflict of British Empire versus the continental power of France, a military power really, in question. And so how is this all going to play out when you have Napoleon's army that is so profoundly capable on the land? And of course, the British are relying heavily upon their imperial associates to support their efforts against the threat from the continent that's coming from Napoleon. And by 1794, 1795, Napoleon is really becoming a very important threat, not only to the stability of Europe, but also potentially against the British Empire. And it's Napoleon's threat to the British Empire, not just the empire, but the home islands, that really create this effort on the part of the British to marshal alliances with the Russians and the Germans. I say Germans, what I mean to say is Prussians and other German principalities, because there was no such thing as Germany, and developing alliances against their common rival, Napoleon Bonaparte, who's using the ideas of the French Revolution and the American Revolution to drive his armies into the heart of Europe. So he's also sending his armies down to Egypt, where British forces also have interests. And so there's a competition for control in the greater Mediterranean. And emerging from all of this conflict is none other than Horatio Nelson, who has been in the Navy for quite some time by the time that Napoleon is coming into power and threatening the stability of Europe. And in 1798, Napoleon famously was able to maneuver his forces at the Battle of the Nile and basically wipe out Napoleon's threat in the Mediterranean, at least for the time being, but also reassert British control in the Egyptian area of operations from their point of view. And I always love these cartoons because you can see the image of Nelson beating down the revolutionary alligators, of course, the red, white, and blue being a symbol of revolutionary spirit. And Nelson is beating those alligators of revolution down at the Battle of the Nile. Coincident with all of that, Nelson becoming a famous hero of Britain, he's also depicted in cartoons because he had developed a relationship with a very wealthy person named Lady Hamilton, Emma Hamilton. And it made all the newspapers in 1801 when Nelson had a child with Lady Hamilton. Now, Lady Hamilton was not somebody with whom Nelson was married. And so this made a lot of controversy for Nelson. The one thing that Nelson did do is he did take care of his actual family back in Britain. But the thing about Nelson and his connection with Lady Hamilton is part of the sort of popular culture of Horatio Nelson and the sort of mythos that develops from Nelson, because his child, Horatio Nelson, lives to 1881 and is sort of continuing the Nelsonial tradition and is participating in all of that. Now, we all remember Horatio Nelson famously took command of the home fleet after he received the commission at Somerset House in London, and he went down to Portsmouth and, of course, took command of the home fleet. And the objective was to find the enemy on the high seas. And at the time, the French, Napoleon, and the Spanish crown had developed an alliance against Britain. And this is now 1804, 1805. And this was a direct threat against British sovereignty. And so Horatio Nelson received the mission of seeking out and destroying the combined forces of France and Spain. And so this was a very important strategic objective, but it's part of a broader campaign. You know, historians talk about the Battle of Trafalgar as being decisive, but it's really the campaign of Trafalgar. My colleagues in the Hattendorf Center have educated me on this, specifically Evan Wilson and John Hattendorf have educated me on the broader context of this great Battle of Trafalgar that we're celebrating tonight, that took place on this day, Trafalgar Day. So the situation is pretty complex in the sense that you have landed power of France that is basically in control of the continent, facing off against a superior naval power of Britain, and they're trying to compete for command of the seas. And it's an open question. The key to victory is to locate the enemy, and Nelson had to go all the way to American waters to confirm his assumption that the combined British forces against Spain and France, they had to go back across the ocean to Cape Trafalgar in order to fix the enemy and commit them to battle. And famously, Nelson brought his commanders together and he told them of his plan to break from doctrine, basically throw the rule book out the window. In those days, the objective was to try and get your fleets lined up and basically fire your cannon until the enemy forces were sunk. Nelson came up with the idea, rather than just line up and shoot at each other, why don't we use the weather, the winds, and maneuver against the enemy line of battle, targeting the fissures between the French and the Spanish fleet, exploiting those fissures in order to divide the enemy and reduce them in a systematic battle. In other words, Nelson came up with the concept of what we call crossing the T of the enemy force. And that's kind of one of the myths and also one of the legacies of the Battle of Trafalgar. Was this Nelson's idea by himself? Of course not. He's talking with his captains. They're playing around and wargaming on their dinner tables, trying to come up with new ways of fighting the enemy. And of course, the idea of crossing the T was a radical idea at the time. But they worked it out. The captains all worked it out, and Nelson came up with a plan and actually wrote out his orders to his captains in detail. He provided broad objectives for his captains to maneuver their ships in order to defeat the enemy the way Nelson had planned it, crossing the T. But he left it to his captains to maneuver their ships because he saw his captains as the commanders of their own ships. Nelson, of course, was the commander of the fleet. And by disseminating his intention to his subordinate captains, he was able to basically drive the operations the way he envisioned it, but also gave the flexibility to his subordinates to make decisions on their own initiative. And Nelson famously issued another order just before contact with the enemy. He said, "England confides or expects that every man," now there were women on board these ships as well, "but that every man shall do his duty." And that is one of the other phrases that comes out of the memory of Trafalgar. And of course, we can see the interesting depictions of the battle as portrayed in the popular media of the time. And again, Nelson was targeting, the red ships are Nelson, but the yellow and blue ships are Spanish and French ships. And you can see that Nelson was targeting the divisions between the enemy force to divide them. Here's a contemporary depiction of the battle from a witness at the time. Now, one thing about Nelson is, just like a rock star that he was, he died well and he died young. Just at the time when the scandal involving his daughter Horatia was really sort of biting in the public media, Nelson goes to the Battle of Trafalgar, and sure enough, he wins the battle. But in the process, a French sniper or a sniper in the topmasts targets him because he's wearing his best uniform with all of his medals. And of course, if you're the sniper, who are you going to shoot? They shot Nelson, and they were able to strike him from above. So the bullet actually hit in his shoulder, just above the heart. And as a result, it came close to his heart, and he died a very slow and painful death down in the cockpit on board HMS Victory, his flagship. Now, with the death of Nelson, British media portrayed him as a saintly type of figure who is, taken to heaven immediately for doing his duty for his country. And Horatio Nelson's myth and memory really begins with his victory at Trafalgar that happened on this day in 1805. So there's this idea that comes out of his state funeral, which took place in London in the spring, actually in January of 1809. This mythology that comes out of Nelson's memory, that he's an immortal figure. And it's the immortal Nelson who defines what the British Empire is going to do in the future on the high seas, because of the example set at Trafalgar, there's this idea that British naval power reigns supreme. Even though the French and the Spanish navies are still out there, and the wars against Napoleon will continue for at least another 10 years. Napoleon doesn't die until the 1821. And so, these wars and Napoleon, the threat of Napoleon continue. But it's the Battle of Trafalgar that seems to resonate in British popular memory as the turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, which set the stage for the disasters Napoleon experienced at Russia. And of course, we remember the Battle of Waterloo. It's because of that immortal person, Horatio Nelson, which is why we celebrate, or at least the British celebrate his memory every year on this day in October. Nelson's death is, lamented by all who knew him as a great naval officer, but also his memory becomes bigger than Nelson himself. He actually was not very tall in stature, but trinkets from Nelson, for example, his pigtail that he had, was taken off him before they buried him, and that remained around as a good luck charm for someone until it ended up in the collections of the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. The bullet which killed Nelson was carried around as another sort of good luck charm by somebody, which goes to the question of, myth and memory. The symbolic service that Nelson gave at Trafalgar becomes sort of part of the life's blood of the image of Britannia. And of course, the veterans of the Trafalgar battle also continued the heroic memory of Horatio Nelson, telling stories of what they did in the war to the younger generation up and coming. And it's that Battle of Trafalgar that sets the stage for all of this memory of Nelson's heroism, which set the example for Royal Navy officers to follow. And later on, of course, American naval officers also aspired to meet with the Nelson ideal. Here's a picture of his uniform at the National Maritime Museum, and there's still the hole that you can see in the upper shoulder, which ended up killing him at the battle. Another interesting thing that came up recently is they found a bottle of the alcohol that was used to preserve his body in order to get him to London for the big state funeral. And to this day, rum is known by sailors as Nelson's blood, because there's a story about when the cask of alcohol reached London, that the cask was actually empty. So who drank the alcohol? Obviously, Nelson wouldn't have been doing that. So the myth is that the sailors were actually siphoning off the alcohol and drinking it. And so that's why rum is widely known within the Royal Navy as, quote, Nelson's blood. And as I said, Horatio Nelson continued participating in curating the memory and the mythology of Horatio Nelson. That's a picture of her roughly in the American Civil War era. And she'll go on until 1881, continuing the legacy of Nelson. And it's Britannia that Nelson is most closely connected with, the idea of imperial federation and the idea of empire, of the Empire of Britain being the stabilizing force in global affairs, comes with the Nelsonial tradition of British sea power all the way through to the 20th century. And it's Nelsonial ideals that also influences American perspectives here at the Naval War College in Newport. So when the Americans are looking for a naval hero, they are looking at George Washington, they're looking at Joshua Barney. Of course, you have Stephen Decatur, but the problem with him is he dies in a duel. And so when people are thinking about the great strategic figure that Nelson sort of represented, the Americans studied that idea. And a lot of that is being influenced by John Knox Lawton, who's the gentleman on the left-hand side of the slide. And John Knox Lawton maintained a very heavy correspondence with the founder of the U.S. Naval War College, Stephen B. Luce. And Stephen B. Luce talked about the examples of Nelson, but he was also talking about the art of studying examples like Nelson for application in future maritime strategy. John Knox Lawton of King's College London had a tremendous influence upon the approach that Stephen B. Luce was taking when he was looking at historical figures like Horatio Nelson. You can see some of the frontispieces from books written by John Knox Lawton or compiled by John Knox Lawton of original documents relating to Nelson. And all of these things are being studied by Stephen B. Luce and his associates at the Naval War College. So when he was framing the early curriculum of the Naval War College, not only was the leadership style and character of Horatio Nelson a subject of interest for American naval practitioners, but also the example that Nelson sets in developing new tactics, techniques, and procedures. So in the early orders of the Naval War College, as written by Stephen B. Luce, we can see that history is one of the key factors. It's actually written in the second paragraph. That's the millennial encryption there. I tried to show my daughters where it says history, but it's in the middle of the page. And Stephen B. Lew said to the practitioners attending the Naval War College that we're going to get a heavy dose of history. And from his point of view, in 1884, it's not very long after the death of Nelson. It's not very long after the Battle of Trafalgar at all. And so it's still close in popular culture, but also close in American memories when looking at the evolution of sea power. And it's that Nelsonian example that is informing how the United States Navy was going to evolve after the Civil War. It's through Nelson's example that people like Alfred Thayer Mahan start envisioning a global mission for the United States Navy, the United States looking outward, the influence of history upon sea power. The influence of history upon sea power is British history that Mahan is talking about. Mahan also talks about the life of Nelson, the example that Nelson set in his time. So Nelson's influence upon American concepts of sea power are quite profound, but they're really hitting at a time when the Americans are using coal-fired ships and starting to reach outward and do circumnavigations of the globe. Now, in the age of Nelson, you could take a sailing vessel around the world and you always had power from the wind. But in the age of coal, you had to find means to maintain your ships on the other side of the planet. You had to get coaling stations. And so there was a lot of discussion in the United States at the time about how to develop that global capacity to influence global affairs with American sea power. And it is Teddy Roosevelt who came to the Naval War College in 1908 and basically said, we're going to shift our fleet to oil, which I talked about in my previous presentation. But the shift to oil is a radical thing that is influenced by a lot of discussion about how the British Empire and the Nelsonian tradition influenced global affairs. And so Teddy Roosevelt said, well, where's our Nelson? And it's at the turn of the century that Teddy Roosevelt encouraged efforts to go and find the American variant of Horatio Nelson, not for the purposes of replacing Nelson or anything like that, but for the purposes of giving the American people, the American taxpayer, a Nelson, a figure that they could rally around. And so in 1906, they went over to France and they actually dug up a corpse and they compared it to the bust that is depicted on the slide. And Teddy Roosevelt actually gave remarks to dedicate the person in the coffin in the picture on the right-hand side. And basically, this is Happy Halloween for you as well. The picture on the right-hand side is the corpse that they brought home from France, and they compared it to the bust of John Paul Jones on the left-hand side, and they declared that that is John Paul Jones. And of course, what's important about this is not whether or not it's John Paul Jones, it's the fact that Teddy Roosevelt went and found an American equivalent for the purposes of rallying support for the U.S. Navy. And by interning that person in a crypt at the Naval Academy, this was a pretty important American statement about the American vision for futures of sea power. But all of this is in the British tradition. So the crypt of John Paul Jones at the Naval Academy, what's really interesting from a comparative standpoint is that it's actually fashioned after the crypt in which Horatio Nelson himself is also buried over in London. So there's a direct popular connection in memory between the image of Horatio Nelson. The Battle of Trafalgar of 1805 took place on this day in 1805. And there's this sort of American variant that was created at the dawn of the 20th century for the purposes of rallying support for the vision of American sea power. And it's about global sea power. It's not just about American sea power. It's about influencing global affairs with sea power. And so Teddy Roosevelt found a fellow traveler in this effort with William S. Sims. And William S. Sims agreed with Roosevelt that the British model was a model that the Americans could adapt in developing the US Navy's second to none concept of the 20th century. And William S. Sims, who would eventually become president of Naval War College, actually developed a very close friendship with John Jellicoe, who became First Sea Lord in the First World War. And Sims and Jellicoe developed their ideas by sharing essentially sensitive technological developments, intelligence material, and you see the burgeoning development of what would become later on the special relationship emerging at the dawn of the 20th century. Now, when Sims is making his remarks in 1910 at Guildhall, it's really only 105 years after Horatio Nelson established British sea power in the Nelsonian tradition. And of course, when an American like William S. Sims says, if ever the time comes that the British Empire is seriously menaced by an external enemy, and that every American would give the last drop of blood in defense of that empire, of course, that is something that's going to make the newspapers. And when he made those remarks in 1910, they referred to this as the quote, love feast. There's this thing that's happening in the American narrative between the Anglophiles and the Anglophobes. And of course, Sims is definitely an Anglophile. And this is going to define the direction in which American sea power is going to take during the First World War era. So when we think about Horatio Nelson and we think about the Trafalgar Night tradition, we can also start thinking about how the Americans sort of adapted that Nelsonian tradition and applied it in the development of American concepts of global sea power. Sims writes about the importance of studying history and the examples such as Sims. He even writes an article called Cheer Up, There Is No Naval War College. And what he's actually saying is, cheer up, my fellow American naval practitioners who are questioning the importance of the Naval War College. You know, there were a lot of American naval practitioners who were saying that going to the War College was a big waste of time. Sims responded to that in the Naval Institute proceedings by saying, cheer up, there's no Naval War College. All it is a practical forum for American naval thinkers to come together and refine their thinking about the future of sea power by looking at historical trends. And Nelson is a big part of those historical trends. And of course, when we think about the Battle of Trafalgar and how that was applied, we can also think about other big battles and how those battles influenced American thinking. Here at the Naval War College, we were studying the British tradition and adapting it from a sea power point of view for application and future strategy. The image of Nelson looms very, very large, of course, in the British tradition, but also during the First World War era, when Sims was at the Naval War College advocating for British approaches to strategic thinking using the Nelsonian tradition to make the convincing argument. It's also the ghost of Nelson that is still looming over the question of Anglo-American transatlantic alliance during the First World War era. Here we see a propaganda poster from the First World War era and the image of Nelson. And it's that type of imagery that William S. Sims, as the commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe, hanging around with the king, also the future king, who would abdicate later on. He's standing next to him. The tall guy in the lower left-hand side is Sims, but the shorter guy is the future king who would abdicate. And next to Sims is the king at the time in the First War. Working with the British has a profound influence upon Sims's thinking. When you're working with the Grand Fleet and the Royal Navy, and you come home as the president of Naval War College, and you recognize that there was a lot of lessons that were learned in that First World War experience, Sims decides to change the curriculum of the Naval War College. And it's Sir Julian Corbett's ideas of a historical section, the theoretical use of history for application in future concepts of strategy, that Sims brings back with him from that First World War. And of course, Nelson is part of all of this narrative of history. Nelson had only, we are as close today to Nelson as Sims was, Sims was as close to Nelson back in his day as we are to Sims, which is an illustration of how important we think about how history is a transcendent opportunity for us to look at issues of the past for application in the future. And this is basically the gist of Corbett's teaching. Here at the Naval War College, Corbett's idea of a historical section, in other words, bringing practitioners together with scholarly historians to apply historical methods of the past in contemporary strategy. All of that is being done at the Naval War College in the historical section under Admiral Sims, but also his friend Dudley Knox and Tracy Barrett Kittredge after 1919. And of course, they're also reading new books that are being published in the era of the First World War, but also the old Mahan books that were published at the dawn of the 20th century for application in post-First World War strategic thinking. You can see the volumes depicted here include those of Corbett, whose works are brought to the Naval War College by Sims after the First World War era. And typical of naval officers, nobody really wants to read all these books. So the gentleman in the picture, Harold Stark, a future chief of naval operations, compiled a volume of condensed sort of cliff notes of all of those books that the naval officers didn't really have time to read, but Sims expected them to read. And what's interesting is in our archives collection, we have the compiled Cliff's Notes for all those books that those American naval officers didn't want to read when they were here at the Naval War College. What they ended up doing is disseminating all the books that they had that they were supposed to read, and they condensed them to paragraph length summaries of what was important in those books. And that's a really fascinating document from our collections at the Naval War College. Dudley Knox, who was part of the development of the historical section, also writes about the application of Nelsonian traditions in his writings. He's looking at George Washington's use of sea power, but he's also looking at Nelson's use of sea power, the great lesson from Nelson for today. Of course, he's writing that in the First World War era. And the very same conclusions that people like Knox, Corbett, and Sims are reaching in their studies of Nelson are still germane in the contemporary context of the 21st century, which is the point in studying this long and rich history. The Battle of Trafalgar was the war game that was used at the Naval War College before the First World War. But it was after the First World War that the Battle of Jutland, the Battle of Trafalgar, become part of the ongoing process of education. And it's during that post-First World War period that people like Chester Nimitz, Ernest King, and other future five-star Admiral Halsey came through the War College, and they studied the battles of Trafalgar, the Battle of Jutland, and they were looking for applicable perspectives that they could use in future wars. And all of that was being done here in the Nelsonian tradition in Newport at the Naval War College. Now, when they looked at the Battle of Trafalgar, one of the problems that they recognized was the fact that the Nelsonian tradition loomed large over the decisions that were being made by John Jellicoe, the commander of the Grand Fleet at Trafalgar. And it's that long shadow that is cast by Nelson that sort of looms over the decision-making process that John Jellicoe went through at the Battle of Jutland. And the whole concept of replicating that great victory at Trafalgar was looming over his decision not to engage directly the German high seas fleet at the Battle of Jutland. And of course, that sort of mythology of Nelson did create problems for John Jellicoe in terms of his reputation, his Nelsonian example during the First World War. And by studying that Battle of Jutland, the Americans were developing new perspectives on how the British were sort of not learning the right lessons from the fact that the decisive battle was probably not what you need. You actually need to develop influence over your enemy. And John Jellicoe actually succeeded by containing the German high seas fleet. And it was Beatty, the man on the left-hand side, who actually made the wrong decision by charging right into the teeth in the Nelsonian way of the German high seas fleet at Jutland. And of course, Ernie King recognized that Beatty was a great showman, and Ernie King is on the right-hand side of the slide. And King sort of adapted some of David Beatty's example by showing himself to look like a winner, which Beatty was very good at doing for the media. And it's those five-star thinkers who attended the Naval War College after the First World War, who studied the traditions of Nelson in detail, the battles of Jutland of the First World War for application in the 1920s and 30s, where they developed the new doctrine that the US Navy would apply in the Second World War context in order to attain decisive victory, not just in battle, but in war, in the Second World War. And it's the education that they received here in Newport as students at the Naval War College, learning more about Nelson, even though they were probably reading the Cliff Notes version when they were here as students. They were at least aware of what they should be reading, and they were applying those lessons in the context of the Second World War. And that's really the important point when we study that period between the world wars of the 1920s and 30s, in recognizing how important truly the Naval War College was in educating the five-star thinkers of the Second World War. Now, during the Second World War, there was a battle on Trafalgar-like scale at the Battle of Lady Gulf. And some historians have argued that the Battle of Lady Gulf is the American Trafalgar. I'm not so sure that that's true, but certainly the mindset, the offensive mindset was something that Nelson was known for, but also the commander on the scene, Task Force 38, the Third Fleet Commander, William F. Halsey, also shared that Nelsonian tradition of aggressive action in battle. And it's at that Battle of Lady Gulf that Halsey sort of makes what some historians have said is a rash decision. I would argue he made a measured decision, but that's a completely different lecture altogether. But again, it's that Nelsonian tradition that does loom as an underlying theme in battles like the Battle of Lady Gulf. So here we are at Trafalgar Night. And normally we would end it with a glass of port. But why do we Americans want to celebrate something as British as a Trafalgar Night? Well, first of all, it's fun. If you've ever been to a Trafalgar Night, a proper one, it starts off with nice drinks and there's a great meal. And we all celebrate tradition and memory of the Immortal Nelson with Madeira port wine at the end of the evening. The Royal Navy, of course, Nelson's blood is also part of the tradition, Nelson's blood being rum. And, you know, all of these naval traditions do have origins, in fact. And it's all about, you know, sort of knowing where these traditions come from that enables us to really appreciate them. But it was under J. Johnson's tenure as the Chief of Naval Operations that an official message did go out establishing the 4th of June, 1942, the Battle of Midway was the Trafalgar from J. Johnson's point of view. I would argue, actually, the Lady Gulf battle was probably a better choice. It also happened in October, but J. Johnson was the CNO and I wasn't, which is why the Battle of Midway is now celebrated by the US Navy as the American version or variant of the Trafalgar. And there's been a lot of publications to that effect, but we can thank J. Johnson for giving us the US Navy variant of Trafalgar. And with that, George, thank you so much. I know I've covered a lot of stuff, but we have to always toast the memory. This is water, I promise, of Horatio Nelson. And thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, David. You're right. That's a lot of material and a significant walk through history, and I appreciate it. And thank you for what you do. And again, keep bringing, making history current day. And it's pretty exciting. And I always get, I get mad at myself for not reading more books when I was younger. To read some of these historical novels now or records. And with what I know now, compared to what I knew then, I'm sure more light bulbs would have come on as I look forward. But so we've got just about 20 minutes or 15 minutes for questions. So I appreciate leaving some opportunity for that with our guests. And we received a couple of chats. We've got two in from John Rogard, who I think you might have touched on his first one, but I'll read it to you anyway. And he says, how would you compare and contrast Trafalgar on the writings of Mahan and Corbett? And I think you might have addressed that. But if you wanted to add something, certainly do so. But his second question was, again, pertaining to the example that you provided, wasn't it more of a paradox that the British ships were T's being crossed before they broke the line?
Yeah, I first, before I answer that question, I want to say hello to my good friend, John, and he's been a great friend, and I appreciate his questions. The great thing about Nelson is there is an endless source of discussion about what's important and what's not. Historians can sit at a table and discuss, what did Nelson really do? What did he actually intend to do? What did he actually do? And, that's always a fun discussion at a round table with friends. What I would say about Nelson is he does provide a wealth of material for naval practitioners to look at and consider. I would argue as a historian, not as a practitioner, but I would argue as a historian that his popular memory is something that is important for us to consider, particularly as exemplified by the way that Teddy Roosevelt sort of concocted an American variant in the John Paul Jones story. And of course, the reef points at the Naval Academy are filled with all kinds of things that John Paul Jones never did or said, but that's not the point of the reef points. And so the important thing about history is knowing that these myths do have an origin somewhere in historical fact. And that's why we do these Trafalgar Night traditions. And again, thank you for those questions, John. I look forward to debating them with you over a drink, maybe.
Very good. Thank you. The other one would be, how are the lessons of Horatio and Napoleon applicable today? And do you feel that we have learned the lessons of the past?
No, I don't think we've learned the lessons of the past at all. And it is my position, and I'll come back to the Nelson part of it. It is my position, it's my opinion, I'm not speaking for the US Navy, that one of our greatest strategic challenges today is the collective, to use the loaded word, the collective ignorance of history. If we don't know the history, we can be victimized by those who do. And the great thing about history is it already happened. So we should take the time, especially in peacetime, to study history, not for the purposes of having a Trafalgar Night or reciting dates and times or anything like that, but for the purposes of looking for those lessons, those transcendent lessons which lie beneath the surface of naval history, for application in our contemporary discussion about the unwritten future. And again, the future is unwritten, and it will be written by those who know history.
So you're telling me I should have read more.
That's what I'm here for, George.
Courses. Well, thank you. And then another question is, who might, so I know you walked us up to really World War II. Who might you consider to be a current Horatio Nelson in the fleet?
Wow, that's a hard question for me to answer because I do think they are out there. I do know that there are Nelsonian personalities out in the fleet today. Some of them I doubt very highly will make flag officer unless there's a situation that enables them to do so. But that being said, I do think that we've had Nelsonian personalities who have risen to the top when we needed them the most. And I do think that they are there in the fleet. I wouldn't say that in peacetime, the opportunity to measure against the Nelsonian figure is really there in peacetime. But I would argue that those who study their profession, and I include the study of history in studying your profession, preparing yourself for that moment that may come at any point in a future war, to be able to do what Nelson was able to do in his time. And that's really the key in peacetime, taking that opportunity to have these types of conversations about esoteric things like Horatio Nelson.
Okay, thank you. A third.
Actually, I'm going to say really quickly, I cruised with Tom Copeman, who became a 3-star, and when I showed up to his destroyer squadron, it was the first time I had ever gotten on board a Navy ship, and I will say that Tom Copeman turned me into the naval officer that I became. And so, for me at least, Tom Copeman's probably my Nelson.
Yeah, he was. I worked for him as the current operations officer at Second Fleet while he was there before he went to his major command ride. Really a terrific gentleman. So again, another question from your colleague John Rugard. Was Waterloo success because of British sea power and the 3 great engagements, Nile, Copenhagen, and Trafalgar?
So the question being, what's the decisive battle? Or
yeah, so it says, what was Waterloo's success because of British sea power and the 3 engagements?
I get it. Yeah, I get it. I think in hindsight, one could say that sure, those earlier battles, the Nile, Copenhagen, Trafalgar, obviously loom very large, but there were other naval battles that took place before the Battle of the essential Battle of Waterloo, which finally put the nail in Napoleon's coffin, at least from a military point of view. But I think it's too easy for us to make that assertion looking in hindsight. I think Napoleon was a threat all the way up until the day he died at St. Helena. Of course, he was originally at Elba Island, and my colleague, Evan Wilson, has recently written a really good paper about Napoleon's escape. And at the time, of course, nobody really knew that it would culminate in a decisive battle like Waterloo. Looking backward from the present day, we can make those types of assertions. But as a historian, I always try and encourage my students, and the method that I like to use is essentially you need to do time travel. You need to go back intellectually to that period and try to see the world through the eyes of the people that you're looking at. So if you're trying to understand the Battle of Trafalgar, we have to go back to 1805 and look at that broader campaign in which the battle exists. Same goes with the Battle of Waterloo. There's an entire story that goes around the dramatic battles at Waterloo. The seizure of La Haye Saint is only one tactical facet in the broader battle of Waterloo, which is also part of a bigger discussion about coalitions, the Prussians and the British and all the other cats and dogs who came together at Waterloo to take Napoleon down. Those are things that we as practitioners need to study, but also I think that history is something that I'm certainly teaching to my younger kids because I think it's useful.
Yeah, no, very, very good. From Peter Pennington, although Cornwallis is a dirty word in America, how important was the role of his brother, Admiral William Cornwallis, in maintaining the blockade and not chasing after the enemy fleets?
Yeah, I mean, Lord Cornwallis looms large. Actually, my wife has done a lot of writing about Lord Cornwallis and where he ends up after Yorktown. And I know his family, his brother is a very accomplished naval officer. And of course, by maintaining a blockade, you're maintaining control of the seagoing lines of communication. And of course, that is a lesson that we can glean for future strategic application. That is also a lesson that they studied at the Naval War College in the early curriculum by looking at not only the Napoleonic Wars, but also the more recent experience in the Civil War, recognizing that blockade actually shut down the Confederacy much more quickly, really, than anything else, because by starving off the Confederacy of access to the oceanic commons, they were able to reduce the Confederacy in relatively short order. I know it took a couple years, but these dramatic battles that took place ashore loom larger in popular memory than the simple blockade which the Union Navy executed. I also like to talk about the first War of Schleswig, where the combined fleets of Russia and Britain came together and basically convinced the Prussians not to go up into Schleswig-Holstein just by parking your ships off the coast. That's a great illustration of sea power. The actual use of force is not necessarily what you need to do in order to achieve your naval objectives from a strategic point of view.
Well, thank you. We have just about 4 minutes left, so maybe just time for one more question from Fred Kobrick. Halsey would not back off in a monster typhoon at Lady Gulf, lost destroyers, and nearly lost battleship New Jersey. He almost lost a star. What lesson did he and the USN learn from this experience? So
the Halsey typhoons are an interesting case study in leadership. That's slightly separate from the discussion about the Battle of Lady Gulf. I would argue that Halsey did use poor judgment, and I think he knew it at the time. His boss, not Chester Nimitz, but Ernie King, actually ordered Halsey to fly back to Washington. Halsey had, after the typhoon, gone back to lick his wounds, but he received flash orders, come to Washington immediately. And according to George Dornan, who was the flag secretary of Ernest King, Halsey came into the office and King made Halsey sit in a chair for about an hour and a half as King was in his office. And then finally the buzzer rang, according to George Dornan, and King gruffly said, "Let him in." And at that point, Halsey walked into King's office, and according to George Dornan, he heard words that even the devil himself would be bashful about using. And so I think Admiral Halsey understood that he made the wrong decision in the typhoon situation, and it cost unnecessarily American sailors' lives. At the Lady Gulf, on the Lady Gulf discussion, I have argued, and based upon my research of the intelligence dimensions, it can be argued, I'm arguing, that Halsey made a decision that was based upon his understanding of the situation at the time. And Kincaid, of course, was very worried about Halsey's decision to go north against the decoy force. But Halsey knew it was a decoy force. His intelligence officer, Mike Cheek, had briefed him on it. They actually had a copy of the Japanese plan. And based upon the situation and the circumstances at the time, I think that Halsey made, at least he claims, and I agree with him, that he made a measured decision to go after the decoy force that was coming down and threatening the amphibious landing beachhead at Lady Gulf. Now, of course, the enemy always gets to surprise. And so when the Surigao Straits situation started to develop, obviously this decision to go north was a bad one. Halsey had already made it. And so just like any battle, the fog of war is always going to be the enemy. But, you know, for us to look in hindsight and judge commanders is sort of unfair to the commanders. And it also denies us the ability to really have these types of conversations and perhaps learn something. And, you know, again, the great thing about history is we can discuss these things and not have bullets flying at us. And if we ever find ourselves in a situation where the enemy is dictating the situation, knowledge of this history can help us.
Right. Well, we'll have to get you back to discuss that again. I know this is the second presentation we had during this academic year, and I thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend it with us and our guests this evening.
George, it's my pleasure, and thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for the questions.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's presentation. Thank you for joining us. And again, a special thank you to our dear friends at the Pritzker Military Foundation on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, who provided generous support for this lecture series. Please join us again on November 18th for a presentation by Dr. Thomas Creeley, Associate Professor and Director of the Ethics and Emerging Military Technology Program, and possibly a student or two who will address their research project or projects. The latest updates are on our webpage, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And for those getting a jump on your holiday shopping, please visit our museum online store via our webpage at nwcfoundation.org. Have a great rest of your evening, and thank you again. Bye-bye.